Welcome to Cedars Unitarian Universalist Church. My name is Jenny Weaver, and I am the worship associate for our virtual service today alongside our minister, Reverend Zachary Vinson. Before we start, let's pause to acknowledge that members of our congregation occupy ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Coast Salish tribes. The homelands of the Suquamish, Duwamish, Clallam, and Chimicum people were ceded under duress through the Point Elliott and Point No Point treaties. We are grateful guests on these lands and affirm the indigenous sovereignty, both past and present. This acknowledgement does not substitute for the need to build authentic relationships with modern-day members of these tribes and to learn about their living culture and history. Our faith community is sustained by the generosity of our members. Your contribution will nourish the spiritual growth of our community through weekly worship and ongoing programs that cultivate connection, belonging, sharing, and caring. Included in the video description and displayed on the screen is information to make a contribution to Cedars through our PayPal account. Please take time either now or later in the service to make a contribution to help sustain Cedars. Your gifts are greatly appreciated. Cedars is committed to being a welcoming and inclusive community. In all the beauty of languages, cultures, and skin tones that come together in your uniqueness, we welcome you. In all the ways you experience and express gender, in the beauty of who and how you love, we welcome you. With all the religious and ethical traditions that inform your spiritual life, we welcome you. You are invited to join us today and always with an open mind, a loving heart, and willing hands. I have to admit, when I learned what today's theme was for the sermon, I was a bit intimidated. The theme is praying for those who have harmed you, and I felt a slight trepidation. Zachary quoted a line from the Bible, and I am not very familiar with Bible passages. The quote was from the book of Luke, and it reads, "Bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you." As I thought about this line, it made me think of my childhood. I was a foster kid, and there were many adults who harmed me when I was young. It's hard to think about praying for those people. I remember having a conversation when I was about 14 with a friend who told me that I would go to hell if I didn't proclaim the same kind of faith that he had. I asked him if my father would go to heaven, if he believed that, even though he had been so cruel, and he told me that yes, he would go to heaven if he repented to God and believed in him. And so I said, I'm going to hell if I don't believe what you believe. And my father is going to heaven if he doesn't repent to me for what he did. I think I may have become a Unitarian Universalist that day because I knew that didn't feel right to me. Even with this early conviction I had, where I knew what I believed about heaven and hell, right and wrong, I didn't think much about praying for my father for many years. I had spiritual practices, but they didn't really involve praying for him. We've had separate lives. I haven't spoken to him for 25 years. And yet, over the last 10 years, I have been successful in praying for him. I now know that praying for him is different than forgiving him, and my forgiveness is not a necessary component of praying for him. That doesn't mean that I can't or shouldn't forgive him. It's just separate. I pray that his soul finds peace, and that the power of universal love, which has many names, will continue to give me the strength to do the right thing, to bless those who curse me. And may this universal love bring blessings to you.
As we come together to worship, we remind ourselves to treat all people kindly, because they are our brothers and sisters, to take good care of the earth, because it's our home, and to live lives full of love and goodness, because that is how we will all become the best that we can be.
It's hard to believe that here we are with these words by Maria Mitchell, found in the back of our gray hymnal as reading number 537. Small as is our whole system compared to the infinitude of creation, brief as is our life compared with the cycles of time. We are so tethered to all by the beautiful dependencies of law that not only the sparrow's fall is felt to the utmost bound, but the vibrations set in motion by the words that we utter reach through all space, and tremor is felt through all time. And so today, may we feel that deep connection that we share as we come together to worship. Come, let us worship together.
Without judgment. I'm going to tell you a story today about a little town that is very close to Whoville. Perhaps you remember Whoville. They have a deep, deep commitment to the Christmas spirit. Their most famous resident is probably little Cindy Lou Who was no more than 2. So you've heard about that place. But have you heard of Whoville and the people who live there, the Whos? They live right down the road from the Whos. And they're going to be the people I talk about today. Now, the Whovilles live in a town which doesn't really have a single vision about how the world should be. They have some principles that they believe in very, very strongly. They believe that everyone is worthy, that everyone should be kind to other people. They believe in the great interconnected web of life. So much so that all of the U's in Whoville are connected by a gigantic invisible thread. This thread weaves in and out of all the people in Whoville, pulling them together, keeping them close. Luckily, the thread is usually invisible. Otherwise, there'll be massive tripping incidences in Whoville. But even though they can't see the thread, the residents in Whoville can feel the thread. And when something happens to one person, it tugs just a little bit on this invisible thread, and someone way down the road can feel what has happened. So everyone is connected, drawn together by a great web. And most of the time, this is wonderful. People get along. I don't want to say that there aren't arguments, because in Whoville, there is a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. And so sometimes people arrive at different answers and they disagree. But most of the time in Whoville, that's okay. There are arguments and disagreements, but people stay in good relation with one another, and they come together and they talk about their differences and they continue on. And so the thread between all people is held together. But one day in Whoville, 2 people have such a disagreement that the thread between them begins to be visible. It grows tauter and tauter, tighter and tighter as they argue, and it begins to fray, and it looks like it may snap because these 2 people are not treating each other kindly. And in fact, eventually, their argument grows so heated that the thread is cut. And they are split apart. They are no longer inside this great web. And what's more, because the thread has been cut, the entire town of Whoville can feel that something has gone wrong. There's a slackness. People feel a little bit more disconnected. The thread has a little more space. And people don't know what to do. What should we do? This has never happened before. The great thread that holds us together has never been cut. What's going to happen? And an unexpected voice pipes up. Little Windy Ewe, the youngest member of Whoville, says, maybe they could come together and talk. Get back together. Find a way to repair what's been broken. The 2 people who've had an argument are reluctant to do this because they are feeling disconnected from one another. They don't have a sense that they are part of a great interconnected web of life. They're mad. They're angry. But little Windy Ewe is convincing. And finally, these 2 people get back together and they have a conversation. And they find a way back into relation with one another. And you know what happens? When they do that, the thread between them is also repaired. and there is a knot in the thread for the first time. And little Windy U looks at the thread, which can still faintly be seen, and she says, "Look at that, because there's a knot, you know what has happened? The thread is a little bit shorter, and we are drawn ever closer together because we have resolved our differences. Isn't that great?" she says. And once again, the thread is complete, and the town is once again in an interconnected web. And now they know that even when the worst happens, even when the thread breaks, it can always, always be repaired. And when it's repaired, it gets smaller, and people are drawn ever closer together. And that's my story about Uville and little Windy U, who is also no more than 2.
Oftentimes during this part of the service, we take some deep breaths and settle ourselves down into a space of reflection together, a space of prayer. And today I want to enter this space a little bit differently. Instead of taking time and settling ourselves, I actually want to take some time and wiggle ourselves a little. Take some time wherever you're at. Just start to notice your body, how you're breathing. Just let yourself begin to move. Often we find that spiritual moments in that stillness, and now take this time to feel it in our movements, in our goofiness together as we wiggle however you feel so called. Even if you're at home and you feel goofy, it's okay. I feel a little goofy right now here as I'm wiggling. Let's just let ourselves moving our bodies, wiggle a little bit more. And now breathe with me. Breathing in and out. Breathing in and out. Noticing that feeling of both movement and stillness in this time together. As we sit together in this space, I offer these words as a prayer. Spirit of life, Spirit of love, Spirit of laughter, be with us in the goofy movements of our life, in the soft stillness of our soul. Be with us as we breathe, as we reach out, feeling that connection that we share, feeling the peace and healing that are possible when we come together. In all the movements and stillness of our life, let us know the strength of community and the love that is possible when we commit ourselves to being together on this journey through life. May it be so. Amen, and blessed be.
In a red state, went to school in a red state. I'm sure it had its effects on me. The folks are free in the Southland, folks are free in the Heartland too. We all listen to the same bands, watch the same shows gun rack. Never been to a NASCAR track. And I ain't Joe Sixpack, though some things are just preconceived. Now I may talk just a little bit strange, doesn't mean that I don't have a brain. I know to comment when it's pouring rain. You know you shouldn't be deceived. To define someone by the place that he's from, I tell you that it's an effrontery. You watch election coverage on TV, you would think we were two different countries. Now I live in a new state, it happens to be a blue state, but it hasn't changed my state of mind. I'm still the same guy I used to be. Raised my kids in a blue state, found people true in a blue state. Some folks back home think we're elitist snobs. I guess it comes from the territory. To define someone by the place that he's from, I tell you that it's an effrontery. You watch election coverage on TV, you would think we were two different countries.
Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. Or alternately, I say unto you, love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use and persecute you. These two variations of this saying are attributed to Jesus in the books of Luke and Matthew, respectively. They speak of a philosophy of deep compassion and forgiveness that calls people to recognize the hurt of those who do us harm. Why else would someone act in hate unless some pain from the past had caused them to do so? Hate begets hate. And as a result, by this line of reasoning in this saying, we, as the injured party, the recipient of the hate, are said that we should hold others in love and compassion, especially when they do us harm. Boy, this sounds nice, I guess. But I'll be honest, in practice, it's a lot harder than we might think. I don't know about all of you, but when someone gets my blood boiling, like really gets me mad about something, it can be hard for me to immediately want to turn around and pray for them, or even to offer them forgiveness. The person who just made me mad, and I'm not always ready to just turn the other cheek. But I think that there's still something to this saying. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. I remember one time when I was in 5th grade, we were making ice candles in Mrs. Hitt's class. These were candles that we made by taking our milk cartons from our lunches and cutting the tops off. Once the top had been removed, a clip with a wick would be placed at the bottom of the container in the center. Once the wick was in place, ice would be poured into the milk carton to fill the container with ice. When the ice was in place, then hot wax, colored using melted crayons, would be poured in on top of the ice. As the wax worked its way down into the cracks and crevices, it melted the ice. As this happened, the wax cooled, filling the space left by the melting ice. After the wax cooled all the way, the carton was cut away to reveal a candle meant to be a holiday gift for our parents. As you can imagine, this sort of activity with fifth graders requires a lot of discipline. Working with hot wax can be hazardous. Mrs. Hitt worked to mitigate these hazards by limiting who was working on their candle at a given time. In groups of 3 students, we would be called to a table in the back of the room to make our candles. While this was happening, everyone else in the rest of the class was busy back at their desks working on another art project. Through all of this, it was stressed by Mrs. Hitt that no horseplay would be tolerated. I can't remember the tenor of the whole room, but as you can imagine, with 5th graders, there was horseplay. Lars Foster Jorgensen and Tyler Chenoweth had gotten up from their desks and began playing with their finger skateboards. These were small, 2-inch long little skateboards that were a popular toy at the time. The primary way of playing with these toys was to take your 2 fingers and pretend like you were skateboarding and propel yourself across the table. This playing with these toys in this way oftentimes led to people getting up out of their seats. Soon it went from just being on a desk or a table, from the table to the wall or bookshelf, or at times even using other kids as a surface to skateboard off of. As this chaotic scene made its way near my desk, Mrs. Hitt turned and saw Lars, Tyler, and I all together at the center of a cacophony of skateboarding. Without missing a beat, Mrs. Hitt ordered all 3 of us out of the room to detention. I was really upset about what had happened. I wasn't involved in the finger skateboarding. I didn't even own a finger skateboard and never got the chance to explain what had actually happened before being sent from the room. In my anger, I swore that I would never talk to Lars, Tyler, or Mrs. Hitt ever again. As you might guess, though, it's pretty hard to go without talking to your teacher as a 5th grader. I managed to finish up that day. It was near the end of the day when we got kicked out of class, so it wasn't hard to avoid Mrs. Hitt for the rest of that day. But soon into the next day, I had to give in, and I had to talk to Mrs. Hitt. Despite this, despite being called on in class, I decided I didn't have to be nice to her about it. I resolved to keep my answers short and avoid eye contact. That'll show her, I thought. Mrs. Hitt caught on to what was going on, and when the time for recess came, she asked me to stay behind. I thought I was going to be in trouble, that she was mad at me too. But that's not how the conversation went. "I'm sorry," she said. Caught off guard, I responded grudgingly. "For what?" "For yesterday. I realized after I sent you out of the room what actually happened. I'm sorry I sent you to detention. I know you weren't involved. Do you forgive me?" I remember a feeling of lightheartedness washing over me in that moment. I didn't want to be mad at Mrs. Hitt. To this day, she's still one of my favorite teachers. And even then, I wanted to like her. I didn't want to be mad at her. And now, with this grudge laid to rest, I felt elated. I no longer felt like I had to carry this anger toward her around. In fact, from that day forward, this experience made me feel a special connection to Mrs. Hitt. Recognizing this, I can't help but think of how I would view this scene now if this moment of reconciliation had never come. How would I feel differently about what had happened, about Mrs. Hitt, if I was still carrying a grudge to this day? It could happen. I know each of us, if we look hard enough, probably has a story about a time when you were young that someone said or did something that is with you and still unresolved today. I have several of them. And in reality, most of these situations will never reach a meaningful resolution. And yet, we still carry them. In preparation for this service, I was reflecting on this idea with Catherine J., our faith formation lead. In our conversation, Catherine brought up a story about two monks that I want to share with all of you. There once was two monks who were traveling together through the wilderness and mountains. Then, one day, after being in the wild for some time at that point, their travels brought them to a small town. As they entered the town, they saw a young woman sitting on a fine couch, meant to be carried by the 4 attendants who stood around her. It appeared that when they had reached the town, the attendants, in their haste to move on to the rest of their tasks, had set the couch with the woman down in the mud and began to unload their cargo. It was only when the woman refused to climb off the couch that anyone else paid any attention to the mud. With their hands full of the cargo they had begun unloading, the attendants began to scramble chaotically, yet still failed to assist the woman on the couch over the mud. As the two monks entered this scene, this chaotic scene of the attendants rushing around and the woman standing on this couch in the mud, they looked at each other and shrugged. The younger monk continued forward. He had little regard for what was happening. He felt the whole scene was beneath him as a monk. The older monk, however, seeing what was happening, made his way over to the woman on the couch. He hoisted her over his shoulder and carried her off the couch over the mud and set her on dry ground. When the monk finally set the woman down, she shoved him aside and turned her attention to the 4 attendants immediately. To the woman, it seemed as if the monk didn't even exist. Without another word or thought of this, the two monks resumed their traveling. They made their way out of the town, back into the countryside. As they traveled, however, the young monk began to think about what had happened back in the town. The woman had been so rude, he thought to himself. She hadn't even thanked the old man. The young monk continued to brood as he walked, and after several hours, his anger finally burst out. "I can't believe that woman back there," he said to the old monk. "What about her?" asked the old monk. "Well, after you carried her on your back across the mud, she just shoved you aside. She didn't even thank you." The old monk took a few more steps and then paused. Turning to his companion, he said, "I put the woman down hours ago. Why are you still carrying her?" We each have those stories of the things that didn't get resolved. Things that we still carry with us, even though the time has passed. But what can we do? These past situations aren't likely to get neatly resolved in the way we would like them to. How can we learn to put these things down so that their weight doesn't continue to burden us on our journey? This came up recently in a session with my therapist. We were talking about the things that you tend to talk about in therapy sessions: family dynamics, formative experiences, childhood trauma. As we were talking about all of this, all the dynamics, my therapist asked me, "Where's your stepdad now? Do you think you'd ever want him back in your life?" Johnny Wayne is no longer in my life. He hasn't been physically present to me since sometime probably in 2006, right around when I turned 18 years old. And the last time that we spoke to each other was sometime in 2016 on the phone. To answer my therapist's question, there was a time when I considered letting him back into my life. That's what prompted the phone call in 2016. At the time, I had this notion that I would share my feelings with him and he'd hear them and there would be some kind of reconciliation between us. The truth is, though, John was an awful parent. He drank too much. He was physically and psychologically abusive. He worked when he felt like it and took his frustrations out on everyone else when things didn't go his way. Much of my energy in my early young adulthood was spent working against his influence in my life. I used to think of him as my what not to do model instead of a role model. His presence had hurt me, and I felt the need to name that to him, for him to hear about what he had done and the impact it had on me. I also think that deep down, I wanted him to say that he was sorry. That's why I called. Well, unsurprisingly, the call did not go as I had hoped. After some pleasantries and catch-up chit-chat, I shifted to the real reason I had called. "I have some things I need to say to you," I said. From there, I explained why I hadn't talked to him in years and the things that he had done to hurt me as a kid. John kept trying to interrupt, but I cut him off. "I need you to hear this," I'd say when he started to speak. He continued to interrupt, and eventually I gave in and listened to what it is that he needed so desperately to say. "You know, you weren't such an easy kid." "I was a kid," I responded. "Well, I just wanted to toughen you up. That's why I did what I did. I wanted to make you a man." At this point, it was clear I wasn't going to get the closure I was seeking. The conversation waned until, in a lull, I said, "I have to go." "Maybe we can talk again?" John asked. "Maybe, but I doubt it," I replied, and then hung up the phone. This was the scene that came to mind recently when my therapist asked me the question about whether or not I wanted John back in my life. And to answer that question, just in its bluntness, no. Realistically, even when I made that phone call in 2016, I don't think I ever wanted him back in my life. What I wanted was to be heard in a way that brought the sort of closure I got from my interaction with Mrs. Hitt. I wanted the sort of closure that would allow me to put down the weight I had been carrying for all these years. But that's not what I got. What I learned from this conversation was that Johnny Wayne, the man I had feared all those years, was not able to hear what I had to say. There was nothing that I could do to change that. Recognizing this, I feel a sense of unburden washing over me when I recognized it. For years, I had carried the ghost of John with me. I was like the young monk who kept brooding about the episode of the woman and the mud. And it took me realizing I was still carrying this weight to finally set it down. And in setting it down, somehow neutralize my own reactivity to the situation. I haven't spoken to John since that phone call in 2016. And honestly, I don't plan to. Not because I hate him or wish him ill, but rather because I have moved on. It took me realizing that I couldn't change anything, that I couldn't change things that had already happened. I know this isn't the most climactic resolution to the story. The reconciliation I had set out in search of wasn't ultimately what I found. And yet still, going through all this did bring me some peace. Now, when I think of John, I don't find myself growing angry or feel afraid, but rather I feel a sense of sympathy for him. No one does the sort of things he did as a parent without being hurt somewhere along the way. This doesn't excuse his actions or anyone like him's actions. It doesn't let anyone off the hook, but it does change the way that I view people, including Johnny Wayne. Now, when I feel myself coming under attack from people, when I find myself at the receiving end of someone else's fury, I pause and wonder, what is this person carrying? At first, I try to stay engaged. Can we get to the bottom of this? Is there a misunderstanding that we could clear up? If feelings are hurt, can that be acknowledged and named? Can this relationship be mended? What would repair look like? As I said, this is not meant to be a way of dismissing what happened or a pass for people to continue to act in angry ways towards us. Instead, asking these questions, it doesn't mean that we have to accept what happened and continue to engage in it forever. Instead, such questions help us to understand if the relationship can even be repaired. Pain begets pain unless it is acknowledged. And when people are unwilling to acknowledge the pain they have caused someone, there is little hope for repair. And when this happens, we must sometimes take a deep breath and pray for those who mistreat us and bless those who curse us. And in doing so, unburden ourselves of the heaviness of hate. We cannot control what it is other people choose to carry through this world, but we can choose what it is that we choose to carry through this world. And so let us choose to carry love for ourselves and for each other, to the glory of life.
We would be one, as now we join in singing our hymn of love, to pledge ourselves anew to searching for that meaning which binds our hearts and points us on our way. As one we pledge ourselves to greater service, with love and justice strive to make us free.
We extinguish his flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
Our service this day has ended, but our service to one another and the world begins anew. As we go forth from this time together, we continue on our journey through life. Before departing, may we take this opportunity to pause and collectively choose to be the bearers of love through this world. Amen.